In 1916, the U.S. Navy finalized design plans for its next class of battleships, slated for construction beginning in 1917. These vessels closely resembled the earlier Tennessee class with one key change. The main battery shifted from 12 14-inch guns to 8 16-inch guns. The Colorado class would ultimately be the final group of standard-type battleships completed. Maryland measured 624 feet in overall length, with a beam of 97 feet 6 inches and a draft of 30 feet 6 inches. Her displacement was 32,693 long tons as designed, rising to 33,590 long tons at full load. She was powered by 4 General Electric turbo-electric drives supplied with steam from 8 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers. This system produced 28,900 shaft horsepower for a top speed of 21 knots, though she reached 31,268 shaft horsepower and 21.09 knots during trials. Her standard cruising range was 8,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, expandable to 21,100 nautical miles in wartime. She carried 64 officers and 1,241 enlisted personnel. She was equipped with a main battery of 8 16-inch 45 caliber Mark I guns housed in 4 twin turrets along the center line, 2 forward and 2 aft after arranged in super-firing pairs. Her secondary battery included 16 5-inch 51 caliber guns, each mounted individually in casemates concentrated amidships in the superstructure. For anti-aircraft defense, she carried 8 3-inch 50 caliber guns in single high-angle mounts. Like most capital ships of the era, she was fitted with a 21-inch torpedo tube on each broadside below the waterline. Maryland's main armor belt ranged from 8 to 13.5 inches thick, and her armored deck was up to 3.5 inches thick. Her main turrets had 18-inch thick faces supported by 13 inches barbettes, while the conning tower featured 16-inch thick sides. Maryland was one of 4 Colorado-class dreadnought battleships built for the U.S. Navy. Her keel was laid on April 24, 1917, by the Newport News Shipbuilding Company in Newport News, Virginia. She was launched on March 20th, 1920, and officially commissioned into service on July 21st, 1921. She was the 3rd U.S. Navy vessel to bear the name Maryland, the first being a sloop commissioned in 1799, and the second an armored cruiser that entered service in 1905. After her commissioning, Maryland conducted a shakedown cruise along the East Coast. Soon after, she was designated the flagship of Admiral Hilary P. Jones. Maryland was frequently called upon for ceremonial duties, making appearances at Annapolis for the 1922 U.S. Naval Academy graduation and in Boston for both the Battle of Bunker Hill anniversary and the 4th of July. From August 18th to September 25th, she made her first foreign port visit, carrying Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes to Rio de Janeiro for Brazil's Centennial Exposition. In 1923, following fleet exercises near the Panama Canal Zone, she transited the canal in late June to join the battle fleet stationed on the West Coast. She served as flagship until later that year, when the role was transferred to Pennsylvania. In 1925, she made another foreign cruise, this time visiting Australia and New Zealand. A few years later, in 1928, she carried President-elect Herbert Hoover during the Pacific portion of his Latin American Goodwill Tour. From 1928 to 1929, she underwent an overhaul, during which her 8 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were replaced with 8 5-inch 25 caliber guns. Throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, she remained a vital part of fleet readiness, participating in extensive training operations. She also carried out multiple patrols during the 1930s. In 1940, Maryland and the other battleships of the battle force relocated their home base to Pearl Harbor, where she was moored at Battleship Row off Ford Island during the Japanese attack on December 7, 1941. On the morning of December 7th, Maryland lay moored beside Ford Island, tethered to Oklahoma on her port side by lines and a gangway. Ahead loomed California, astern, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Farther back, Nevada and Arizona completed the line. These 7 great warships, recently returned from maneuvers, formed the heart of what would forever be known as Battleship Row. As the clock neared 9 a.m., many aboard Maryland were eating breakfast or preparing for shore leave. Suddenly, the sky erupted with the roar of enemy aircraft, and thunderous explosions rocked the outboard ships. In that instant, Maryland's bugler sounded general quarters, summoning her crew to battle. Seaman Leslie Short, scribbling Christmas cards beside his machine gun, was the first aboard to fire, bringing his weapon to life and blasting one of 2 torpedo bombers that had just unleashed their payload against Oklahoma. Shielded by Oklahoma's hull from the initial torpedo strike, Maryland escaped the worst and swiftly unleashed the full fury of her anti-aircraft batteries. As Oklahoma rolled and sank in the chaos, her surviving crew scrambled onto Maryland's deck, rallying to man guns and fight back against the onslaught from the skies. Maryland took 2 punishing hits, armor-piercing bombs that tore into her low hull. One slammed through the forecastle awning, blasting a gaping wound roughly 12 by 20 feet. The second punched in at the 22-foot waterline near frame 10 and detonated deep within, flooding compartments and dragging her bow down by 5 feet. Yet even wounded, Maryland kept firing, her guns thundering defiantly skyward. When the skies cleared, her crew rushed to aid nearby ships, battling flames and desperately trying to reach those trapped in the overturned Oklahoma. As her sailors stood ready for a second strike, the toll became clear. 2 officers and 2 men had fallen in the fight. Though the Japanese triumphantly claimed Maryland had been sunk, they were gravely mistaken. On the 30th of December, scarred but unbroken, she steamed into Puget Sound Navy Yard behind the wounded Tennessee. During her overhaul, 2 of her original 12 5-inch 51 caliber guns were removed, and her outdated 5-inch 25s were replaced with a full set of 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose weapons. For 2 relentless months, she was refitted and reforged, armed with new fighting gear and renewed purpose. By February 26, 1942, she was ready once more. After shakedown cruises along the West Coast and to Christmas Island, Maryland returned to the fight in June, becoming the second Pearl Harbor battleship to rise from the ashes and rejoin the war. During the pivotal Battle of Midway, Maryland stood ready in the shadows. Like her older sisters, she lacked the speed to keep pace with the swift carrier task forces, and so was assigned to a reserve fleet guarding the west coast, an iron sentinel awaiting the call to war. While the clash unfolded far to the west, Maryland remained on alert, every gun manned, every watch sharp, prepared to steam into battle if summoned. When the thunder of Midway finally faded and the tide of war had turned, she was ordered to San Francisco. Her role in that moment quiet, but her presence a steel backbone behind the fight. In the months that followed, Maryland was locked in near-constant training, drilling relentlessly with battleship divisions 2, 3, and 4 in preparation for the next clash. On August 1st, she returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs, her first time back in the scarred harbor since the Day of Infamy. In early November, she steamed out once more, this time alongside Colorado, bound for the front lines. On November 12th, King Neptune himself came aboard to oversee the time-honored line-crossing ceremony, initiating her polywogs into seasoned shellbacks. Maryland then sailed for the Fiji Islands, patrolling the waters as a bulwark against Japanese expansion. Together, the two battleships stood as vigilant sentinels, guarding the gateway to Australia and sweeping the seas for any sign of the enemy. As 1943 dawned and the tide of war shifted, the Allies seized the initiative after their hard-fought gains in the Solomons. In February, Maryland and Colorado pushed forward to the New Hebrides, taking up station off Ifaute. But the sweltering heat was relentless, a miserable test of endurance for their crews. From there, Maryland moved to Espiritu Santo, standing watch for any sign of Japanese incursion, yet the tropical assignment offered little respite, as oppressive heat and torrential rains battered the ship and her men. In August, both battleships departed Aore Island Harbor. Back at Pearl Harbor for a 5-week overhaul, Maryland was readied for the battles ahead, her decks and foremast bristling with newly installed 40mm anti-aircraft guns prepared for the skies to erupt once more. On October 20th, 1943, Maryland left the Hawaiian Islands behind, bound once more for the South Pacific, and this time for war. She now served as flagship to Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill, commanding the mighty 5th Amphibious Force and the Southern Attack Force for the coming invasion of the Gilbert Islands. Aboard her decks stood warriors destined for history: Major General Julian C. Smith, leader of the battle-hardened 2nd Marine Division, and Colonel Evans Carlson, legendary commander of Carlson's Raiders. Maryland steamed back to the staging grounds at Efate Island, where a vast task force gathered, steel and resolve coiled tight, preparing to strike the blood-soaked shores of Tarawa. The Battle of Tarawa erupted on November 20th, and with it, Maryland roared into her first offensive action of the war. At 5 a.m., her mighty guns thundered to life, unleashing 5 blistering salvos that silenced a Japanese shore battery on the southwest point of Bedio Island. An hour later, she began a relentless bombardment, hammering enemy defenses ahead of the Marine landings. Maryland boldly edged closer to shore, daring the enemy to reveal their hidden guns, scouring the beaches with fire, pummeling bunkers, pillboxes, command posts, and anything else that moved. At 9 a.m., as the Marines were cut down in brutal crossfire, Maryland raked the beaches with precision fire, silencing several machine gun nests. Overhead, her scouting plane tracked the Marines' grim advance, calling down more steel from the ship below until it was hit, the pilot wounded in the fight. Still, Maryland pressed on. After 3 relentless days pounding enemy positions on Badio Island, Maryland turned her guns toward Apamama, shifting to guard the next wave of Marine landings. There, resistance was light. Just 30 Japanese defenders stood in their path. 2 prisoners were taken and brought aboard the battleship. Silent echoes of a fading garrison. On the 7th of December, 2 years to the day since the attack on Pearl Harbor, Maryland departed Apamama, her mission complete. After a brief return to the harbor where her war had begun, she pressed on to San Francisco, battle-worn and resolute, for much-needed repairs before the storm ahead. On January 13, 1944, Maryland thundered out of San Pedro, California, setting her bow toward war once more. She joined Task Force 53 at Lahaina Roads, where for 2 days her decks bustled with purpose. Ammunition loaded, tanks refueled, stores packed tight. A new campaign loomed: the assault on the Marshall Islands. On January 30th, Maryland surged into battle alongside Santa Fe, Biloxi, and Indianapolis, forming the hard-hitting Northern Support Group of TF-35. Their target? Roy Island. The guns were primed, the orders clear. Another enemy stronghold was about to feel the fury of the fleet. In the dark hours before dawn on January 31st, Maryland and her sister ships opened fire on Kwajalein Atoll, unleashing the first thunderous salvos of the Battle of Kwajalein. Her guns shattered Japanese strongpoints, blasting apart fixed artillery and pillboxes with ruthless precision. The barrage was so intense that turret number 1's liners cracked under the strain, silencing it for the day. Undeterred, Maryland pressed on. On February 1st, as U.S. forces pushed ashore, she continued pounding enemy defenses. For the next 2 weeks, she served as Admiral Connolly's flagship, a vital hub for resupply and refueling amid the chaos. On February 15, 1944, she departed with carriers and destroyers in tow, bound for Bremerton Navy Yard, where her battered guns would be replaced, preparing her once more for the long war ahead. 2 months later, on May 5th, Maryland once again turned her prow toward the Pacific, joining Task Force 52 in its drive toward Saipan. Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner gave the force just 3 days to break the island's defenses before the assault. At 5:45 a.m. on June 14th, the silence shattered. Maryland's guns thundered to life. Coastal batteries were silenced almost immediately, and then the fleet unleashed hell on Garapan, igniting ammunition dumps, smashing gun emplacements, sinking small craft, and obliterating bunkers and buildings in a storm of steel. Maryland shifted her fury to Tanapag, leveling the town in a relentless barrage. On June 15th, the invasion began, and as Marines hit the beaches, Maryland stood just offshore, raining fire in support of the men fighting for every inch of sand. The Japanese struck back from the skies, desperate to drive off the battleships, hammering their island strongholds. On June 18th, Maryland's gunners claimed their first aerial kill, downing a Japanese plane amid the smoke and chaos. But on June 22nd, a Mitsubishi G4M3 Betty bomber slipped in low over Saipan's still contested hills. It found its mark. The torpedo it dropped slammed into Maryland's starboard bow, ripping a gaping wound into her hull. Though casualties were light, the damage was severe. Within 15 minutes, Maryland was limping toward Eniwetok, steaming in reverse the entire way to prevent further damage. 2 destroyers flanked her battered frame as she made for the repair yards at Pearl Harbor. 2 brave men were lost in the attack. With shipyard crews working day and night, Maryland was brought back from the brink in just 34 days, steaming out on the 13th of August, scarred but ready for vengeance. She joined a massive task force bound for the Solomons, anchoring at Purvis Bay off Florida Island for 2 tense weeks of preparation. Then, on the 6th of September, she turned her guns toward the Palau Islands. Assigned to Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf's Western Fire Support Group, Maryland opened fire on September 12th, blasting enemy positions to shield minesweepers and underwater demolition teams at the start of the brutal Battle of Peleliu. On September 15th, as landing craft surged toward the beaches, her guns roared again, pounding Japanese defenses with relentless fury. 4 days later, organized resistance crumbled, and the battered fire support ships, their task complete, withdrew to the Admiralty Islands at month's end. Maryland surged toward Seidler Harbor at Manus, where she was reassigned to the 7th Fleet under Admiral Kincaid, now bound for the Philippines. On October 12th, the fleet thundered forth, and Maryland joined Task Group 77.2, the heavy gunfire and covering force for the long-awaited invasion of Leyte. At dawn on October 18th, 5 battleships, Maryland among them, along with a formidable screen of cruisers and destroyers, pushed into Leyte Gulf. Taking her position between red and white beaches, Maryland unleashed a thunderous bombardment to break open the shore for the troops. At 10 a.m. on October 20th, the invasion began. As American forces surged ashore and quickly secured the beachhead, Maryland stood guard in the Gulf, ready to meet any Japanese counterattack that dared rise from the sea. In the days that followed the Leyte landings, the skies turned hostile. Japanese aircraft launched wave after wave of desperate air raids, and for the first time, the haunting specter of the Kamikaze emerged, pilots turning their planes into human-guided missiles in a final bid to halt the invasion. Then came darker news still. Far out in the South China Sea, U.S. submarines caught sight of 2 advancing Japanese forces. One, a vanguard of 5 battleships bearing down on San Bernardino Strait. The other, a decoy fleet of 4 carriers lurking off northern Luzon, both racing toward a climactic showdown. On October 24th, Maryland joined West Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, forming a wall of steel at the southern end of Leyte Gulf to guard Surigao Strait. Alongside them, steam cruisers, destroyers, and swift PT boats, all poised for the coming clash. In the early hours of October 25th, the Battle of Surigao Strait erupted. Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, flanked by their escorts, pressed forward into the narrow waters, straight into the trap. At 3:55 a.m., the silent American line roared to life, launching a devastating ambush of torpedoes and heavy shell fire. Destroyer-launched torpedoes tore Fuso apart, sending her to the depths, while relentless gunfire from the task force hammered Yamashiro until she too was sunk. The shattered remnants of the Japanese force fled toward the Mindanao Sea, only to be harried by relentless Allied aircraft. After the thunderous victory at Surigao Strait, Maryland remained on watch, patrolling the southern approaches until October 29th. She then steamed to the Admiralty Islands for a brief respite and replenishment before returning to Leyte on November 16th, resuming her guard over the landing forces as waves of Japanese air assaults continued. But on the 29th of November, tragedy struck. A kamikaze aircraft diving out of the sky with murderous precision slammed into Maryland between turrets number 1 and 2. The suicide plane tore through her forecastle, main, and armored decks, blasting a hole in 4 inches of steel, igniting fires and leaving devastation in its wake. 31 men were killed, 30 more wounded. Her medical department lay in ruins, scarred, but miraculously still operating amid the wreckage. Maryland held her station, battered but unyielding, patrolling the perilous waters until December 2nd, when at last she was relieved. With 2 shattered destroyers in tow, she turned from the front lines, her hull scarred by fire and steel. On the 18th of December, she arrived at Pearl Harbor, the site of her first wounds, where she entered the yards once more. There, over the coming months, the ship was reborn, repaired, refitted, and reforged for the battles still to come. With her wounds mended and guns ready, Maryland set course once more for war. On March 4th, 1945, she departed for the Western Pacific, arriving at Ulithi on March 16th. There, she joined the mighty 5th Fleet and Rear Admiral Mortondeau's Task Force 54, an armada forged for one of the fiercest battles yet, the invasion of Okinawa. On March 21st, the fleet departed, steaming into the storm. Every ship braced for the brutal fight that lay ahead. Maryland was ordered to the southern coast of Okinawa, her guns trained on targets meant to draw enemy eyes and fire away from the true assault to the west. This diversionary landing would help shield the main invasion, and the Japanese struck back with fury. Waves of air raids descended, and 2 of Maryland's radar picket destroyers were hit by kamikazes. One of them, the Luce, vanishing beneath the waves. On April 3rd, Maryland shifted to the west coast, joining the cruiser Minneapolis to silence enemy shore batteries with thunderous precision. As the troops surged ashore, Maryland held her post off Bolo Point, delivering relentless fire in support of the hard-fought battle on land. Maryland held her position, pounding enemy strongholds until April 7th, when she surged north with Task Force 54 to intercept an approaching Japanese surface force. Among the enemy ships was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the massive battleship Yamato. But before the American fleet could engage, U.S. carrier aircraft descended like a storm, hammering the Japanese with wave after wave of relentless airstrikes. By day's end, 6 of 10 enemy ships had been sent to the bottom. As dusk fell, a lone kamikaze burdened with a 551-pound bomb screamed down from the sky and slammed into the top of turret number 3 from starboard. The blast obliterated nearby 20mm gun mounts, igniting their ammunition and fueling a deadly inferno. 10 sailors were killed, 37 wounded, and 6 vanished in the chaos. Still, Maryland refused to yield. She remained on station for another week, enduring further air attacks and continuing her bombardment, though turret number 3, damaged but still intact, fell silent for the rest of the mission. On April 14th, Maryland withdrew from the fiery shores of Okinawa, her guns falling silent as she turned to escort retiring transports. Through the waters of the Marianas and past Guam, she steamed toward Pearl Harbor, and from there pressed on to Puget Sound Navy Yard, arriving at Bremerton on May 7th. There, she was reborn once more. Her aging 5-inch guns were stripped away, replaced with 16 powerful 5-inch .38 caliber weapons in sleek twin mounts. Her anti-aircraft arsenal was transformed. 40 Bofors 40mm guns in 10 quad mounts and 36 Oerlikon 20mm in 18 twin mounts now bristled across her decks. Other sources even claim she carried 44 of each. Either way, the message was clear. Maryland would return to the war deadlier than ever. Maryland's transformation continued deep within the shipyards. Her massive armored conning tower was removed, replaced by a lighter STS structure with just 1.2 inches of armor, offsetting the weight of the powerful upgrades she now carried. Her magazines received an extra 3 inches of STS plating, while 2 inches of armor was added elsewhere along the protective deck. The turret tops were thickened to 7 inches, and new double-layered anti-torpedo bulges increased her armored freeboard, balancing strength with stability. Her SK radar was upgraded to the more advanced SK2, and her mighty main battery was fitted with cutting-edge Mark 13 fire control radars. Turret number 3, once silenced by fire, was fully restored and crew quarters were overhauled. In August, Maryland emerged from dry dock, repaired, modernized, and ready to fight, only to see the war end just as she departed for tests and training. With the war's end, Maryland took on a new mission, one of homecoming. She joined the Operation Magic Carpet Fleet, trading gunfire for mercy. In the final months of 1945, she made 5 voyages between the West Coast and Pearl Harbor, carrying over 8,000 weary servicemen back to American soil. On December 17th, she arrived in Seattle, her final Magic Carpet run complete. The following spring, on April 15, 1946, she entered Puget Sound Naval Shipyard and was placed in commission in inactive reserve on the 16th of July. Her long and eventful service came to a quiet end when she was decommissioned at Bremerton on April 3, 1947, remaining moored in the Pacific Reserve Fleet, silent and still. At last, on July 8, 1959, the gallant Fighting Mary was sold for scrap to the Lerner Company of Oakland, California, her steel spirit passing into history. On June 2, 1961, the legacy of the Fighting Mary was etched into stone and memory. Governor J. Millard Tawes stood before a solemn crowd as he dedicated a monument to the battleship Maryland and the brave souls who served aboard her. Forged from granite and bronze and crowned with the ship's own bell, the tribute rose proudly on the grounds of the State House in Annapolis, a permanent sentinel to honor her valor, her sacrifice, and the men who sailed into history beneath her guns.